Good morning. Today, we're happy to be hosting a discussion on creating and refining leadership. I'm Captain Quinton Packard, the Navy Fellow here in the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The book is entitled Might of the Chain, Forging Leaders of Iron Integrity, and we're glad to welcome its author, retired Rear Admiral Mike Studeman. For the sake of brevity, I'll summarize his lengthy bio by saying that he was an intelligence officer who led Navy, joint, national, and interagency teams at every level during his 35 years of exemplary service, culminating as the commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence. He is also a recognized expert in foreign policy, defense matters, and Asian affairs. It's great to have you here today, sir. Mike's work reads like a call to action. He opens with several indicators of a crisis of trust in leaders today across the U.S. because, as he asserts, they are failing to meet expectations and demonstrate integrity. To correct that, he charts a course in his book that illustrates essential leadership principles, starting with individual development, progressing through team building, and finally, detailing how to scale sound leadership successfully. Each short chapter recounts a first-hand experience that highlights a different characteristic, which makes this book approachable, enjoyable, and a must-read for tomorrow's leaders. To talk with Admiral Studeman about the book, let me introduce Kari Bingen, who is a senior fellow in our Defense and Security Department and the director of the CSIS Aerospace Security Project. Over to you, Kari.
Thank you, QP. It is great to be here. Welcome, everybody. Rear Admiral retired Mike Studeman. So wonderful to have you here.
Thanks, Kari.
I first met Mike when he was the J2, which is the Director of Intelligence at U.S. Southern Command. They have responsibility for all of Latin America. What stood out to me was his clarity and directness about the challenges before him. This is a command that doesn't get priority, doesn't get assets or resources, and so you had to do more with less and do it creatively. And I saw you bring those same skills to the jobs that you had after at Indo-Pacific Command, at the Office of Naval Intelligence. We kept in touch after you retired. And when I learned that you wrote a book on leadership, I wanted to bring you into here at CSIS to talk about it. So the book, Might of the Chain, Forging Leaders of Iron Integrity, you received some pretty decent endorsements on it. You have Dr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, Admiral Jim Stavridis, who all endorsed and recommended the book. What is striking to me is that you very much drew from personal stories, experiences where you were in the middle of crises, from your childhood, from successes and failures, to share what you've learned about leadership over your career, and I think also to give us some insight into your career itself. You're a deep China expert, so we'll also discuss a bit on the strategic challenge of China, the profession of intelligence, and so for our audience members here joining us, I encourage you to ask questions. I'll make sure we save time towards the end for questions. Go on the event website, click Ask a Question, and I'll get those here in real time. So Mike, welcome. Let me start out by asking you the question, why did you write the book?
Thanks, Kari. It's great to be here. I know this was your summer beach read. I think I still see some sand particles there between the pages. Thanks for going through it and appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. You know, I finished out 35 years in the Navy in the Joint Force, and I looked around and said, how can I still contribute and stay on mission? And one thing that had really disturbed me was the quality of leadership in various places across America and what it was doing to the country. And I thought to myself, let me research this. And no kidding, when I looked at Harris, Gallup, and U.S. News and World Report polls, it was actually shocking, the statistics in this sort of leadership crisis that was being captured. There were 4 out of 5 people, for example, thought that there was a crisis in leadership in corporate and government. There were 4 or 5 people that were looking at trust declining. 3 of 5 people saw that there weren't leaders that they would aspire to be in their organizations. 1 in 3 people didn't trust mass media. Trust in Congress and our leadership in Washington was very low, for Congress down to 2%. And the question was, what's going wrong here? I mean, when I take a look at America's history, there were great leaders that managed to rise above the fray, figure out how to compromise and move our country forward during peacetime and during crises. So what was different about today? And I realized that we had lost a step with leadership, and we needed to find our footing again and restore some of those basic leadership competencies that have really made America what it is today. And so I do think we find we're in a more difficult environment, and that takes great leadership to see us through those kind of situations. So, look, we've always been a divided America. We're diverse. We have a lot of different views about how we ought to organize ourselves, what decisions we need to make. But good leaders actually find a way to work even in an environment of disagreement. Today, however, we find people sort of running to sort of this maximalist agendas, and it's this sort of warring parties and culture wars that we have. This is not actually helping our society. So I thought, as I retired, maybe I can just relay some pointers, things that I learned from other great leaders I spent time with in the service.
And can you explain the structure of your book? Because you have these three broad sections, and then you have these great, short, personal, relatable stories for a whole host of folks, whether you're earlier in your career or you're later in your career. Explain that structure and your thinking there.
Well, let's start with the title. Might of the Chain actually comes from the fifth law of the Navy. All midshipmen need to memorize this. It was written by a British admiral. The fifth law goes, on the strength of one link in the cable dependeth the might of the chain. Who knows when thou may be tested, so live that thou may bearest the strain. And the issue there in Might of the Chain is we're only as strong as our weakest link. And the way that I broke down the book was to say, look, when you're first starting out, but even throughout the rest of your life, if you're focused on continuous and never-ending improvement, you need to make sure that your individual link is strong enough to be able to contribute to anything. If you want to have a meaningful life, if you want to have a rich life, you want to work with other people, you're going to have to bring your own strong individual link into those kinds of relationships. But you also, and that's the first section of the book, there are a number of characteristics where you work on yourself where, just like a stainless steel link there that you can resist life's corrosion, you can be, a polished steel that can reflect light back into the world, and you're ready for life's tests. The second section of the book deals with, okay, you're going to need to interlink with one another. And so what does that chain look like when it's connected together? Because how you operate as a team member is really important. And some people sometimes underestimate what it takes to actually interconnect well. And I use the illusion of, well, your link needs to actually be buckle and burr free. You need to articulate well with, another link that you're attached to. And so how does that work when you're trying to build up a team that's going to work well together? And the third section is, okay, now that you're interlinked, now that you're a strong chain, how do you do heavy lifting when you're truly trying to relieve burdens or raise something to the next level, go for the heights? You're going to be under a lot of stress. Those chains are going to have to work well for you to truly do the uplifting that's required. And so that's how I broke it up. You start with yourself, you build the team, then the team does something great.
I really like that approach. And so let's unpack each of those sections. The first one that you mentioned, which is focusing on yourself, so forging yourself. And I'm going to ask, there was a quote from a chapter entitled Born and Bred. So starting out, I didn't fully appreciate when I met you later in your career just how much you were in the arena on some really notable crises in our history. So when you just started out as a junior intelligence officer, you were thrust into the middle of the first Gulf War in 1990 to 91, Desert Shield and Desert Storm. As a lieutenant commander in 2001, you were the assistant N2, so that's the director of naval intelligence, the assistant N2 to the 7th Fleet in Japan, which is the world's largest forward deployed naval force. You were there when a Chinese fighter jet collided with an EP-3 surveillance aircraft in international waters, and the U.S. crew held hostage in China for 11 days. So, man, I imagine stuff got real for you. What did you learn from these early career experiences, particularly when you were put in the middle of those crises?
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, there are lots of shocks and surprises we're going to encounter in our life, and so how do you actually prepare for those? Sometimes you can't, but in other ways you really can. Learning as much as you can, as early as you can, about what suffering you can potentially face, what kind of black swans may come your way. I learned as a junior officer during Desert Storm a lot about the importance of intelligence and getting it right. I carried a lot of guilt. Our squadron had to fly from the Red Sea off the USS Saratoga. We had a number of short-range surface-to-air missile systems that hit our aircraft and took down my squadron mates. And it was a tough environment. We had a number of our aircrew that were held prisoner of war. We didn't know their fate. Bob Wetzel, Jeff Zahn, good examples from my squadron. VA-35 is an A6 squadron. And I'm an ensign going through all of this. I'm the intelligence officer that should have been able to articulate all of the dangers that they were going to face. And you learn real quick that some things actually aren't in your control. That the dangers do abound, that it's a very personal life and death business here where there are lots of risks, and intelligence becomes very real to you very quickly when you're caught up in those kind of circumstances. And so I learned a lot. I carried a guilt that somehow I didn't figure it out. Like, how can I be a better intelligence officer the next time? How can I understand all of the adversary capabilities? How would I know the friendly capabilities and how those would interact such that you could truly have the best plans that give you your best shot at success, while minimizing risk to those who are actually on the front lines in combat. And it carried me through this passion to make sure you get it right, because I knew what the impact was from the very get-go as a young officer there at sea. So very formative for me, and by the time I got to 7th Fleet as a lieutenant commander and saw larger geopolitics playing out, some things like the EP-3 incident in April 2001, little mini crises there reflecting the state of the U.S.-China rivalry and where that was headed and how those dynamics played out. The idea that the EP-3 was going to be completely exploited and our intelligence was going to be lost to the Chinese, thinking through those implications. But we had a near Pakistan-Indian war after terrorists attacked Parliament, and other things happening on the Korean Peninsula there. And so what you realize, the key lesson there is that you have to constantly keep learning, that you're never going to be perfectly prepared for your environment. And if you're looking at leadership, I say that the best leaders are those who, no matter how they started off, whatever gifts that you had early in life, you need to continue to sort of cultivate the innate capabilities that you have, because ultimately these challenges only intensify with time, with increasing responsibility that you get. And therefore, those who are more concerned about continually developing their leadership capability, refining it over time, are the ones who end up being the best leaders. So you can be a born leader, but I also believe that you are bred leaders as well. And the ones who are deeply committed to going well beyond their start points are the ones who can make the biggest difference in the world.
Well, and your early comments too. I never wore the uniform. Spent several years working as a staffer in Congress, time as a senior leader in the Pentagon. My most valuable experiences were getting out in the field. We can sit and make policy, but unless you really understand what those folks at the edge are going through, the challenges they have, and to know that some of the decisions you're making have life and death consequences, that is just so sobering. So thank you for all that you've done on that front. There's another section in here on balance and self-care, or a couple chapters on balance and self-care, and I resonated with this. You tend to think that you have to be hard charging all the time to climb in your career, and I imagine that's very present in the military. You write about tough choices that you made in your career to find balance. And I think you also acknowledge a bit of learning from your mistakes. I mean, both balance and self-care are really hard things to do. I mean, I'm pretty crappy at it. Talk about those experiences and some of the lessons you drew there.
Yeah, I thought I was invulnerable when I was a junior officer. I could do anything. I could take on, any amount of responsibility and juggle a lot of things. And I found out that, people can do extraordinary things. They can surge and things can work out, but ultimately there are limitations, and you have to be more self-aware, I guess, than most people are. And I think a lot of young people kind of realize where sometimes they reach break points. I ended up as a lieutenant commander being in charge of a lot of things related to China projects there for the Director of Naval Intelligence. And I remember I was in one of his updates in the Pentagon one day, and there were at least 3 projects where the Director of Naval Intelligence, the 2-star admiral, was like, "Who's got lead?" And someone would say, "It's Mike." "Who's got lead?" And it's Mike. And I was like so proud of myself because I would explain the project, and there were some pretty big things. I walked out into the foyer there of the Director of Naval Intelligence office, and for some reason, everything got cloudy, and I tried to fight off this tunneling, and I fainted right after the meeting. So everyone's coming out of the meeting, there's a Director of Naval Intelligence, and I faint. Like, I pride myself on some athletic capability, and here I am, boom, I'm on the floor, right? And I hadn't had a lot of sleep, I had traveled, young son doing nighttime feedings. I hadn't had breakfast that morning. I was just charge. And it all caught up with me at exactly the wrong moment. I was so embarrassed, right? And just a classic lesson there to say, hey, you do need to be great for your people. You need to be awesome for your mission, but you have to be good to yourself too. You have to figure out this balance and the self-care piece of it. I learned some other lessons later on as a captain too, that proved that I hadn't fully learned the lesson. Life gets pretty intense at times, but listen, you will end up slowly imploding if you don't figure out a way to bring the healthy choices into your life. Some of that is rest and recuperation. Some of this is nutrition. Some of this is like how you take care of your physical activity. And I think those other things are actually sources of extraordinary strength for you when you're dealing with your profession. If you neglect those at your own peril, they will catch up to you at some point or another. So balance, an important thing. You will never have a perfect balance, but as I say, when you're over tilting in one direction, like you're on a teeter-totter, you need to know when to push off with your feet before the butt plate hits the ground. You ever?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, next section of the book, you talk about shaping your team. So you've focused on yourself and your fundamentals. Now, how do you bring that team together? I will say that there's a chapter in here on civility that really resonated with me. And in this time period that we're in, it's so sorely needed. I remember the first member of Congress that I worked for, and yes, I said Congress. One of the things he would always tell me was, we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that has stuck with me. So you've led teams throughout your career. What are the most significant leadership lessons that you've taken away in building a team, and in particular, a high-performing team?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, look, your character matters more than anything else. So, look, if you have character, nothing else matters. If you don't have character, nothing else matters. This is the core. This is the pillar upon which everything else rests. Because, look, if you have good character, people understand that you're in it for the right reasons. It's not just about you, that you have an honorable intent, and that builds trust. That trust is so essential to actually getting a team to operate. If everybody's out for themselves, right, nobody's going to be willing to deploy all of their talents because they're just, suspicious about where those are going to, go and who they're going to benefit. You need to be able to have character to build the trust, and then have the noble cause that allows this team to come together and everybody kind of pull in the same direction, not in their own individual directions. And this is part of the reason why I think in corporations today, in the media, in government, you find people looking at other leaders and saying, I can't trust that person to do what we're setting out to do by way of this cause, because there's too much ego in there, or there's too much greed or selfishness or something else that pulls that person into a different kind of orbit. And so the best teams are ones that truly come with a very strong understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and they can believe in the person to their left and right. Mm-hmm. And so those are the critical elements of pulling together a team. There are many more characteristics, but those are the three main ones that I would say.
Okay. And you also have a chapter in here on climate, and I'm going to pull a quote, which is, quote, "So the climate of any organization is created hour by hour through the multitude of choices and behaviors of its members," end quote. I could almost replace the word climate with culture, and that's something we talk about in the government all the time, as organizations have these cultures, and they're so hard to change. And I imagine that's the way in the private sector as well. So advice for us on how do you build, but really also how do you change culture?
This is the tough stuff, because some cultures don't lend themselves to easy refinement or change or those kind of things. But this is the stuff that's not in your inbox. Like when you first get to a position, there's not going to be an email that's bolded black that essentially says, read this, right? Because I want you to do 10 things to be able to shape your culture. Leaders, I think, figure this out soon enough that when your climate is right, everything is easier. When your climate is wrong, everything is harder. And if you don't invest in your climate as a leader, you're ultimately going to find that you're stamping out fires for all the wrong reasons, rather than finding that your team is fired up for all the right reasons. Mm-hmm. And so climate takes investing in the blind. It requires discernment about what you are seeing around you and deciding kind of where your organization may be. And then it's this investment that senior leaders especially need to do that has nothing to do with Project X or Project Y, right? Mm-hmm. It's not on your must-do list that comes from somewhere else. It has to come from your understanding innately that if you don't work on this, that you're going to be in the consequence management business because something's going wrong somewhere, right? You want to be proactive and be forward-leaning and defining reality for your people, not just laying out the vision and setting the objectives here, but what is the nature of the relationships that are happening within your organization? Where may there be trouble? Why is there trouble there? Like, how do you uplift people proactively, right, to bring them on board and have them focused on the right things? Because if you don't look at the parts of an organization that should be cohering, if you're not part of that glue that keeps everybody together, focused on the right things, then you do have this sort of fragmentation that takes place, and you find that there are other key influencers lower in your organization who may have different goals and objectives, who then begin to tear apart parts of your organization. You have to step in to that space, and you have to invest there in a way that actually brings your climate into the right places and sustains that climate over time. And when you're successful, people down the chain will believe that it's the right thing to do, and they will self-reinforce those things even when you're not around.
Yeah, that's really, really well said. You are a career intelligence professional, so I want to touch a bit about just your experiences within the intelligence arena. There's a chapter here called Forceful Backup, and you discuss needing independent-minded truth tellers and avoiding groupthink. And that very much is true in the intelligence world. There's an often used saying, intelligence professionals need to speak truth to power. So can you spend a minute or two here to reflect on just the profession of intelligence, how you think the tradecraft is evolving? There's so much more information, even disinformation. Technology is being incorporated, with things like artificial intelligence and whatnot, into the trade. The speed of need is even greater now. So what needs to change? What stays the same? Just talk a bit about the profession of intelligence itself.
Yeah, I think we're pretty on the ball, and we're delivering a lot of fantastic intelligence for the investment that's made there. But that's not to say that we don't have our own challenges going forward. I think technology is one part of it where, look, we're going to have to be very careful about how we bring in generative artificial intelligence into the fold. We have a tradecraft process where we have a very clear idea of how we identify all of the different factors that may lead one to conclude, in a certain way with a certain amount of confidence as we predict kind of how a geopolitical situation may be unfolding. AI potentially blinds us to essentially the encyclopedia of how you got to that particular assessment there. So how do we actually see the forensics of how the machine ends up saying that this is what's happening, or this is the right way to then move forward with recommendations on policy or use of military force or whatever it is. And so I do think that we'll work our way through it, but we haven't yet. We're putting some investments that will pay off there, but this is a challenge for the community. I personally think that we have to get better at selective disclosures. We have lots of ways to obfuscate our intelligence because there's so many different sources of information today. And look, I've called it in the past that the worst thing is when you have omniscient spectating. Essentially, the intelligence community and those that they support have a very clear-eyed view of what's happening in the world, but you can't action that intelligence because you can't reveal it, because you're very afraid, almost paralyzed by sources and methods. There are protecting those sources and methods, which we need to do, but there are ways to protect those and still selectively take out extracts from our intelligence that then can be actioned in time to make a difference. And what I found is that we're still culturally, it's almost an anathema to ever consider that you would move anything. You can move something from compartment to top secret, maybe top secret to secret, but secret to unclassified, to support strategic messaging, to expose Russian or Chinese malign actions, to be able to actually, provide an evidentiary base to other folks to understand, what those countries are doing in the world. This has not been our forte. We, in multiple combatant commands and from Indo-PACOM, we're always requesting from the intelligence community that they let more of it out, cleansed, sanitized, so that we can actually begin to compete better than what we were left with. And so I think that's an area. And then thirdly, the economic intelligence side of it. Look, economic warfare is part of our life in the 21st century now, with much more adversarial environment with China and Russia, North Korea, Iran, their client states, and the global South countries that support them. Economic warfare and the securitization of everything now requires the intelligence community to step in to support the United States in ways that maybe it hasn't fully had to do in the past. Like, we could provide intelligence to policymakers, to military commanders, and we could say our job is done, and we could sort of, wipe our hands. I don't think that's the case anymore. If the fight for technology, who has a technological edge, and who will define, what happens in the future based on that sort of control over technologies, then we need to think about how we help American companies truly compete. When you have a China that has state-sponsored subsidies and a plan to essentially, rob other countries' intellectual property and then use it for their military and security purposes, we need to find a different way in deploying the intelligence community to assist with this here, and it's going to take some hard conversations about what is our role in intelligence in economic warfare, and how do we do that right and fairly across the country.
Well, you are segueing me perfectly to the third section of your book, which is called Transforming Your World. So you focus on the self, you build your team. Now, how do you affect change? And there's a chapter in particular here called Boldness, but what it was striking to me is, so last year you gave a keynote speech at a defense symposium. This was while you were still in uniform. It was entitled An Intelligence Officer's Perspective on China. And you wrote that no one was articulating the China challenge in any sort of comprehensive way. Give us that short, bold version here. You've hit on some pieces of it, but talk us through what is that holistic challenge that we're facing?
Yeah, look, I shouldn't have to be really feeling like I need to do more on this even after retirement, but I feel that way because I think that we've not had enough strategic communications from our leadership, and particularly, in the administration that we have. We've either been overheated on China in the last one, or we're under-treating China in this one. The last two administrations clearly have been doing a lot of quiet things, maybe some things that people have read about, trade wars here, or the Chips and the Science Act, if you understand why that was passed. But we are not talking about China, for example, in our State of the Union addresses or in presidential speeches. The National Security Advisor or cabinet officials really sort of run away from connecting all the reasons why America should be far more informed about the dangers to Americans from China. We do it event by event. You have the FBI director talking about a specific thing. You'll have, somebody from DHS maybe talking about critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, but nobody really is stitching together the holistic look about, why China is a challenge to the nation and what we therefore need to do about it. The most you might get is the CCP Special Committee, where there's a lot of fantastic work going on, but it's almost treated by Americans as sort of a fringe thing. And so I think we need to find our voice. I think officials need to ensure that if there's any 21st century challenge that we actually need to talk about, that it's going to have to be something that involves these nation states and what they're planning on doing. My speech was simply to say, let me sort of just keep this simple, but I'm going to run across the gamut of all of our concerns related to China. And the last thing that I listed after listing 15 issues with China was Taiwan. Many people want to boil the China problem all the way down to the potential for China to aggressively take over, Taiwan. But I put that last to say the China problem is not all about that one contingency, that we have something else that we need to address as a society. And I think our leadership needs to be honest and communicate to the American people what's going on, and therefore what we need to do about it.
Well, and I do want to hit that last item on Taiwan, because you were the first general or flag level officer to go officially to Taiwan in over 40 years. And I mean, given your incredible depth of knowledge on China, the military forces and capabilities, it obviously made a tremendous amount of sense. Anything that you can share with us on, what your message was, but then also as you take a step back and you look at other world events right now, how warfare has unfolded, whether it be economic or information or military in Ukraine, what we're seeing in Israel, Gaza, are there lessons for Taiwan to perhaps take away?
Yeah, my secret mission to Taiwan that ended up not being so secret, it was in the press before I'd even arrived in Taiwan. So I ended up being asked to brief President Tsai and the national security team over there, all their intelligence and defense officials, on a couple of different things in two of my three visits during the time I was the Director of Intelligence in Indo-PACOM, all sanctioned by the National Security Council staff and those in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And the issue on the first visit was to say, look, this is how the Chinese are planning for these extreme courses of action, including up to an invasion. And here's what we think they would likely do. And so consider this as you look at your own defense budget, as you take a look at how you're going to do whole of society resilience, all the ways in which the Chinese intend to try to pull Taiwan in and essentially make Taiwan the next Hong Kong. The second visit that I went out and executed was about lessons from the Ukraine war. This was 3 or 4 months after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and so we knew at the time there were plenty of early lessons about what had transpired before the actual invasion, all the way through to how things had fared in the early goings. And so I brought that to them as well, so they could consider what not only Taiwan may need to do in those kind of circumstances, but what was China potentially learning from that experience too, and how were they going to change their approach based on how they were seeing their friends in Moscow, handling the war.
I'm going to shift to some audience questions here that are really good, and I would encourage our audience members to continue submitting them. We are fortunate at CSIS to have a phenomenal group of interns that come to us every semester. So one of those, Jacob Bradley, asks, what do you see as the biggest difference in acting as a civilian versus a military leader?
Yeah, I think that when you're in the military, there's automatic deference. The positions clearly, are earned in a way where the rank sort of is there. The expectation for how, a major or a sergeant, would interact with a colonel is pretty straightforward, right? I think that in a civilian organization, you don't have the trappings that make sort of an instantaneous, understanding of the chain of command, where proper roles and functions are, outlined. That sometimes I think in a civilian organization you need to have the authority that comes from how you interact every single day, because you're not wearing eagles or stars now. People are going to follow you based on, once again, your character, whether or not you're decent, well-intentioned, whether or not you're demonstrating respect and civility, how do you comport yourself, how do you talk to people. Those are the kind of characteristics that become even more important, I think, when you're just not wearing clearly, here's your senior officer. And so we have to pay attention to those. So people are very careful to place their trust behind somebody they can believe in. And if they see some measure of doubt about whether or not they should, you're not going to be able to get that person to be fully on board with whatever you're trying to do. And I think you see this sort of fragmentation occurring where there's just enough doubt in the civilian world about whether or not somebody's really in it for their own paycheck. Are they in it for their next career ladder advancement? Or do you care about the team? Have you actually been able to inspire that trust and be able to then kind of deploy everybody's talent in a concentrated way to do great things? I think it's a little harder as a civilian, perhaps, than as a military officer.
And actually, you're getting me to think too. I mean, there's also this issue of trust and intelligence, and I want to credit my colleague Emily Harding at CSIS, who focuses a good amount on this issue. I was recently rereading a great article that John McLaughlin, former acting director of CIA, wrote, but it was on the relationship between the intelligence analyst and the policymaker. And you touch on this as well in your book, but it's how do you make, what is that, what do you see as a relationship between intelligence providers and the policymakers who consume it, but also how do you make policymakers better consumers of intelligence and intelligence analysts better providers to the policymakers?
Yeah, John McLaughlin's a great guy. He's a great magician too. I've seen him in action there. So I do think that you have to be persuasive with policymakers. There's a famous quote with Kissinger, essentially, he said to somebody who had forwarded reports to him, look, you informed me, but you didn't persuade me. And there's a big difference, right, between, warning somebody, being able to sort of talk about what's happening, and convincing somebody that they need to act, that this is strong enough now that you need to act, and maybe in this direction here. And so this is a dilemma of a lot of intelligence people, because look, we are people who are pragmatic. We see the world for what it is. We don't have to do a lot of imagining here. We have some insights about what's going on. Policymakers sometimes have an ideal that they're striving for. They want to make change. They want to see it. They see the world that they want transformed in a certain way. So you have the person that's more focused on the world that they want to see versus the world that they have to deal with as it is. And so sometimes the intelligence people come in, they can be spoilers when they talk about the reality of how hard policy X, Y, or Z could be to implement, or how it could backfire, or second or third order consequences. So there's a natural friction, I think, sometimes between these two camps there. You just have to, I think, have some empathy for the other side, be able to figure out how to speak their language, be able to be as helpful as you can be in the conversation. It's not here you give the report and walk away. It's the report is the first entree into an ongoing conversation with whoever you're trying to support. And when you're in those circles of trust, then you can shape things in the proper way. But you can't just do a fire and forget report and expect you're really going to shape the change that will be, I think, more ideally suited to the environments that we face.
Well, and that's a great point, because you need to be inside those decision loops and those conversations. But there's also a bit of a line there, too. You're not, as an intelligence professional, you're not the policymaker. So then you have to also be careful, too, that you don't cross that line.
Right. I found that most of the people that are enlightened on whether you're a military commander or you're a policymaker, they really do give you an invitation to be part of those conversations, and you can step into that, and you end up talking about more than intelligence as an intelligence officer. Like when you're invited in those circles, now it's just anybody that has an ability to contribute something of value, regardless of what your designation is or what community you come from, is going to be useful as people are deciding on the hard stuff. That's when you know you've made it. When it doesn't, you're not there as an intelligence officer, you're there in sort of the chamber of decision making as just another person contributing to a good decision.
Okay, I like this question. Now that you're no longer in uniform, what are your news sources to stay informed on current events?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a National Security Fellow with MITRE. I maintain my clearance there, but I'm not reading traffic every day. And what I found is that, 35 years in the business has given me a very, very strong foundation there to understand a lot of the world. I'm concerned about my half-life or the decay of knowledge there, like everybody should, and so you have to work hard. So look, I'm doing a heck of a lot of reading and talking and engaging and going out, and spent a lot of times with teams working on particular projects. Was just down in Indo-Pacific in Hawaii. I'll end up going to Japan and Taiwan here at the end of the month. This is now multiple trips abroad. All of these things are important sources of information to stay fresh and to stay relevant. And if you don't do that, if you sort of sink into this sort of thing, like I'm going to have my old knowledge carry me through, I think you're going to become less relevant, and I think you may actually misguide people later on. So I do take it seriously that outside of the uniform and the daily staple of traffic, that you have to work almost 3 or 4 times as hard to be able to stay current. I would make one more observation. There's an amazing amount of open source literature on almost every issue under the sun. Like you have to have an ability to evaluate information and their sources right. I use tradecraft every day when I read the news. What's the source? Do they have an agenda? Right? How much confidence can I place in this? Is it circular reporting? Like all those things, Kari, that we've gone through our entire lives, I'm applying it religiously every day. But at the same time, if you can do that right and you can filter in a way that's responsible, you have a lot of rich material out there that will give you a strong understanding about what's going on.
So I'm going to ask 2 more audience questions here, and then we'll wrap up. And I'm first going to put you in the middle of some current events here. Do you believe that the United States has been too reactive rather than proactive with regard to the PRC's maritime and aerial confrontations in the Pacific? From one of our interns, Carson Keller.
Yeah, I do think we've ceded the initiative to the Chinese in many fields here. I believe that we need to be able to put those small tactical events into the overall strategic context. This failure to connect all the dots, right, makes the situation harder for you to take a single tactical event. Let's say Chinese bullying in the South China Sea with water cannoning or lasers or boarding and things like that. You might tend to see that only on its own merits. And the responsibility, I think, of the United States government and our allies and partners is to be able to say, look, this event demonstrates something about the Chinese way of thinking, about their intent, and how it's connected to their overall strategic ambition to displace the U.S. and many of the stronger Western powers on the world scene, become the strongest pole in a multipolar world, and to be able to redefine the international order. And so they will continue to push there. And if you treat everything as sort of this small tactical thing where you're going to do a symmetric response, I think you're failing to use the asymmetry of the information domain or other levers that you can use to be able to shape China's rise. It's proving to be more aggressive with coercion and either outright, pushing across, and it's worrying to all of the Chinese neighbors out there. And so the question is, how do we paint the landscape that people can understand so that contextually now they understand they're going to have to deal with this as a package deal, right? Not as a singularity. And I therefore think that we have more instruments to use than we are using, and we're particularly anemic, unfortunately, in the information domain. We could really power up there. And once you get the information domain correct, then people will feel more comfortable using other instruments to complement kind of now what you know. The knowledge comes first, the situational awareness, and then the best choices you can make with you and your friends to be able to deal with a very thorny situation.
That's a whole nother conversation we'll have to have you come back and talk about, which is how do we counter the PRC and the information domain. We've been fortunate. Several of these questions are from interns and young folks, which I really, really like. One of the questions is, what advice do you have for the next generation of leaders? How does a young leader pursue what you describe in the book as a noble cause?
Yeah, I think young people should be reading the right things. They should be following good examples of leadership. They should, through the book, they'll probably get a good idea of maybe how to judge people and whether or not they should put their stock in them. Should you join a company where you don't know exactly what the leaders are like, or should you do your homework? And should you be interviewing that company rather than you feeling like the company is interviewing you? See what I'm saying? This ability to know what outfit to belong to. Like I would just say that there are ways that you can observe it from the outside. But if you ever want to step into those circles, you need to be scrutinizing whether or not this is the camp that you can get behind, right? And it comes down to the people that you're going to interact with, what they say about their leaders, and how you see, their leaders behaving. So those are choices that require some discernment. I also believe that there are lots of people who are ready to be mentors, and being able to be confident enough to ask somebody to be, helpful to you. It's not just a test in sort of courage. It's an important way that you will learn in life, is to be able to understand that there are lots of people that are willing to sort of share their insights, and you just need to ask, to have the gumption to ask. And one of our favorite things, Kari, you'll agree with this, is like when people start, inquiring about X, Y, and Z, we love to help them. Like we want to give back, we want to pay it forward. And so I think you have to have the ability to sort of reach out in a way which may be scary at first, but in the end you'll find that a lot of people want to help you on your journey. It's like Paul Coelho in The Alchemist. Like once you set out to do what you want to do, like the whole world is helping to see you along your path. And that's what it is if you're really going for the right things. So yes, I do think it requires you to step out of a comfort zone. I do think it requires some research, but look, people will resonate with you. You'll know it's right when you're in that relationship, and you'll know it's wrong. And if it's in one of those wrong relationships, or a chain of command where something is flawed, you need to maneuver. You need to figure out a way to get away from something that's toxic because you deserve better than that.
I really like that. It's doing your homework, doing your due diligence, but also trusting a bit of your spidey senses
Right.
as well. Well, let's wrap up here. I want to go back to the first quote that we put up and get to the so what here is leading well is the quintessential source of American excellence. The indispensable virtue that enables greatness in our land. So we go through all of these vignettes, I think some very personal insights from your career, but give us the so what now. Why does leadership really matter, and how do we know what right looks like? And then final words from you here.
Yeah, I think that we are challenged domestically and internationally, and probably in a more significant and intensified way in the 21st century now than even during the 20th century and the Cold War. We've had, tests of our, fortitude, of our strength, of our ability to be trusted to lead in the world, or even lead in a smaller organization. And that trust has dwindled. That we have a lot of people who look around and say, I'm not sure that I can use want to use my talents in a way that contributes to something greater than myself in this particular area. And look, Americans shouldn't suffer from poor leadership, either their own, if you don't have good leadership characteristics, because ultimately leadership is about how you interact with others, your relationships, how you develop those, how you sustain those. So if you don't have good leadership qualities or skills, or you're not working on those, your life is going to be, I think, less impactful, less meaningful, less enriched. So there's a personal thing in here. But look, Americans shouldn't have to suffer from poor leadership occurring at the national level or, at a corporate level either, right? And we have to hold our leaders accountable for these performances that we expect. We expect that there'll be a civil, agreeable way that we can disagree. We expect that in our form of governance that we will have to compromise to move ahead. Otherwise, we're paralyzed. It's gridlock. And so now more than at any other time, I think we need to take a hard look at ourselves, introspect, and find our way back to where we have been in previous decades and eras where we made America what it was, right? Now we need to work hard to be able to work on that leadership component, which I think is the key to unlocking all of our future advances. And if we do that right personally, as an organization, as a country, I think we'll end up flourishing. We continue to devalue leadership, and I think we're going to continue to suffer as a country.
That's so well said. This is such an important topic, and we are at a precarious time in history. So I think we can use a lot of frankly, the common sense and the advice that you offer here. And I think the leadership lessons that you offer, they're broadly relevant, as you said, whether you're in the military, you're a civilian, you're in the private sector, you have a community group at home. I think it's broadly relevant. I think it's broadly relevant for individuals at any point in their career, from just starting out to at the senior-most levels. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for all that you've done in service to the nation. And Mike, it's just great to see you again.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Kari.
it.
Thanks for your service, too.
Lastly, just want to thank Kendra LaFave here at CSIS and Captain QP Packard for supporting this event today.
All right, Kendra, QP, you guys are awesome.
you.
Thank you.